Before we get on to talking about your marvelous new book, Dressed for War, I thought I would just ask you a little bit about your body of work up to this time, your many previous books, an impressive body of work indeed. Elizabeth has mentioned one or two of them. I wonder if you'd like to begin by telling us what sort of theme or common thread has driven your choice of topics for your writing?
I think the main theme is the subject of people, ordinary people, getting themselves into extraordinary situations and then getting out of extraordinary situations again. And so the two areas I've written about are mountaineering on the one hand and war on the other. And I think it's very important to emphasize, I have no enjoyment of war at all. I hate the idea of killing people, and I'm not interested in the military history of the Second World War, which has been the focus of my attention. But I am fascinated about how people reacted in that extraordinary era to circumstances that are not totally dissimilar from today. There are parallels, but we may get onto that later. But basically people, ordinary people, and how they dealt with the war and with the aftermath of the war.
And is that that's fairly evidently a theme which continues in your present work?
Well, it does. So it all kicked off with a biography I wrote of my grandfather, who was on the River Kwai. He was the colonel who built the bridge on the River Kwai. And when I finished the biography in 2004, the editor said to me, I think that messy bit at the end, you know, when he came home and his children didn't recognize him and his wife didn't like him, I think we'll leave that out. It's all a bit messy. And I said, no, that stays in because life is messy. And it was keeping that area of the book in the last two chapters, which looked at how he came back to life, if you like, after the war, that really has spurred the next few books. So I then looked at the impact of men coming back on women and families. That was in Stranger in the House. And I looked at the impact of the evacuation program and how children went away and then came home and how they dealt with the strangeness of being back in a family that they left weeks, months, sometimes years previously. And so that's the sort of area I've become interested in. And it's a very rich scene. There's an enormous amount of uncharted water there because it's something that many people didn't talk about after the war.
Was it a surprise for you to discover that you and Audrey were distantly related, or was it through a known family connection that you actually came upon her as a subject?
No, I'm very embarrassed to tell you that I haven't done my due diligence, and I was writing a book for the Imperial War Museum called Fashion on the Ration, which looked at the social impact of clothes rationing and austerity and so forth on the war and on people in general. And I was very impressed how the government used women's magazines to get to every possible area of women's lives. So from knitting and women in home, right up through Harper's Bazaar to Vogue. And Vogue being the most important fashion magazine, you know, the editor was Queen Pin. And I was talking about the book to an uncle of mine, my father's youngest brother. And I said to him, I've come across this remarkable woman, Audrey Withers, you know, who's ever heard of her? She's quite astonishing. And my uncle just looked at me, broad grin on his face, and he said, didn't you know she was your grandfather's first cousin? I had no idea. He did have 62 first cousins, so it was a very big family.
Wonderful. So I take it you'd never met her?
No, sadly not. Although the really sad thing for me is that we lived about 3 streets apart when I lived in London in the 1980s, and she didn't.
Oh gosh.
2001. So, you know, I could have come across her, but I think I would have been more intimidated writing a biography of her if I'd got to know her in her late life. I think in some ways it's easier to approach a subject like this if you don't know them personally, but you have some sort of sense of the family and how the family react to things.
Right, thank you. One thing that stands out in your book, among many, is the wonderful period detail and atmosphere that you managed to create. This must be down in part to your already great familiarity with the period, but also on account of painstaking research. And the book does reveal some fascinating journeys you undertook on research trips. Can you tell us something about your sources and what inspired you most particularly on your travels?
Yes, absolutely, I can. So I am a great believer in storytelling, and the books I write are not deep history, they're not military history, they're social history. And I think it's very important to create an atmosphere when you're writing social history that makes your reader really understand what the world looked like in the 1930s and 40s in this case. And the reason I'm so convinced of this is because when I wrote the book Jambusters about the WI, and it was turned into a drama series, I had this absolutely unique moment when I was watching them filming the very, very opening scene, which was some cows being herded into a farmyard. And I grabbed my son's arm and I said, "Oh my God, Richard, this is the world I've been writing about for 20 years, and it's come to life, and it breathes and it smells and it has real presence. It's three-dimensional." And that was a real light bulb moment. And so when I came to research Audrey Withers, and because I was writing about fashion and clothing to some extent, I was very keen to make sure that I had an absolutely authentic backdrop to the book, so that my readers would trust that I was writing about the 1930s, the 1940s, and later the 1950s. And I had an extraordinary piece of good luck when I went to the Condé Nast archives in New York. And I'd become convinced that Audrey Withers had more material existing somewhere than existed at Vogue in London, which had very little, because Audrey Withers and Cecil Beaton destroyed the Vogue archive in 1942 for the paper salvage effort. And I really cannot believe as a historian that anybody could do that, but they did it for all the right reasons. And when I was in New York, I was speaking to the archivist and I mentioned that I was very short of material. And she came out of the archive with a box. And it was quite a big box. It was a sort of like a big foolscap folder. And she opened it up and I just put my hand over my mouth and I went, "Oh my goodness, you have found the memos." And what these memos were exchanges between the editorial department in London and the editorial department in New York, about 6 memos a week. And they were more like emails than letters. They were quite dashed off, and sometimes they were handwritten, and very often they had typing errors and crossings out. And they were quick fire email type memos telling the editorial team in New York what was happening in London, and vice versa. And the memos that I found in New York spanned 1940 to 1947. And what I had was 900 memos that gave me the complete picture of British Vogue's wartime experience and the immediate post-war era. And it just lifted everything off the page. It was so exciting.
I think you described that as the most extraordinary find in your research career.
Absolutely no about it, John. It was just extraordinary. And I knew how important it was. And the moment I really realized was when I found a memo, number 632, from June 1941, where she described commissioning Cecil Beaton to take a photograph of a model against bomb-damaged London. And I've got goosebumps now, because what she commissioned was Beaton's most famous fashion photograph of the war, which was called "Fashion is Indestructible." And it's a model standing with her back to the camera against the bombed, damaged Temple, which was hit in May 1941. And it was just this extraordinary moment when I realized that Audrey Withers, far from being the sort of editor who had no interest in fashion, which was her reputation post-war or post her retirement, far from it. She knew exactly what she was commissioning for the magazine. And that was just, it was breathtakingly exciting. It really was.
Wonderful. In your researches, I no doubt you used Audrey's own autobiography quite a bit, but did you discover particular omissions and differences that startled you, given the other evidence you were looking at?
Yes, Audrey wrote her biography when she was 84. No, she wrote it in 1984, so she was in her late 70s. And it really truly is a book that's remarkable for what she left out. So although her entire career was, apart from 4 years, was spent working for Condé Nast Publications, she devotes only about 85 pages of it in the book. And the other half of the book she devotes to her father's extraordinary collection of friends. He was a sort of professional friend to the literati, and his art collection, which was not insignificant. But she was very self-deprecating about the impact she'd had on Vogue magazine. And that autobiography really framed how people looked at her and her legacy in the years after she left Vogue in 1960. But she was extraordinary. There was no mention, for example, in her autobiography that she was a member of the Design Council and that she'd worked on the Britain Can Make It exhibition of 1946. She was the head of the design team for that exhibition. No mention of it in her book. There was almost no mention of her first marriage to a man called Jock Stewart, who people have subsequently told me was so dashingly good looking that women would primp their hair and straighten their skirts when he walked into a room. There's no intimation of that in her autobiography at all. And then her second marriage to her husband, Victor Kennett, again is dealt with in a quite perfunctory way. And I think she was a very private woman who didn't like to look back. And when I came to find her voice in the Vogue memos and in the letters that she exchanged with people in the 50s and 60s, what I was really struck by was her energy, her sense of humor, her sense of fun, and her absolute total concrete belief that there was nothing a woman couldn't do. And that was a real revelation for me.
Yes. One high point in the book is Audrey's appointment as editor in 1940, just about the time the phony war gave way to the Blitz, I think. Mm-hmm. She had huge challenges to face, not least the struggle to continue publication in the face of bombings and shortages. Wasn't this her finest hour? And how did she manage it?
Well, she took the view that she wasn't going to get a mere war and the Blitz get in the way of her publishing her magazine. And she had two reasons for that. So she asked herself in September 1939 whether Vogue had any relevance as a women's magazine in the Second World War at all. And she answered her own question two ways. One was by saying that Vogue had existed in the First World War and circulation had been higher than at any other time, and had been hugely inspirational in giving women not only information about fashion, but also news about the war itself. And then she felt that the government trying to get its propaganda message over to women should be directed and curated by the editors themselves rather than by the ministers. And so she took responsibility of dealing with how the messages that the government wanted to get across to women were conveyed to them. So she had been acting as editor since March 1940, because her American editor had gone back to the United States. So 6 months later, when she was appointed, or 7 months later, when she was appointed officially in September, she was already completely confident that she knew how the magazine should place itself, not only as a very important fashion and women's magazine dealing with not just clothes, but all aspects and issues that were present at the time. But she also had one eye on how Vogue from Britain was being observed by American Vogue. And quickly she realized that actually London became the center of attention in the Second World War. New York was sort of offside. France had fallen to the Germans. And so suddenly London Vogue was the main body. And so even during the Blitz, she simply decided that they would print, or they would put the magazine to bed in the cellar. So they had a bomb cellar in the bottom of number 1 New Bond Street, which is where their offices were. And whenever the sirens went, they just beetle downstairs, 6 flights of stairs, and get to work in the cellar. And there are some marvelous photographs of her wearing a het and her lovely Chanel black and white coat, just presiding over girls sitting with typewriters on their knees, and the art director, snipping his wares up with his bottle of glue and his scissors. And there's just this real sense of buzz. And she never failed to get the magazine out. I think November 1940 was 2 days late, and December 3 days late, because number 1 New Bond Street took a hit. But after that, it came out on time, month after month after month, right through until 1945.
And it was published fortnightly or monthly, or?
Monthly from September 1939 or October 39. It had been up until then a fortnightly magazine, but
right,
because of paper rationing, they decided, or Harry Yoxall, who was the managing director of Condé Nast Publications, which owned not only Vogue but also House and Garden and Condé's other publications in the UK, he decreed it should be monthly and a very much reduced size, which it duly was, because I think by the end of the war, the amount of paper available to magazines and newspapers was about 19%, 19% of what it had been in pre-war years.
So circulation was presumably limited.
So circulation was limited to 80,000 copies a month, but she commissioned a survey in 1946 to see how many people read Vogue, and she came out with a stunning figure of 14 readers per magazine. And it was thought that during the war it was higher, it was about 23. So it had a circulation or a readership of about 2 million people a month, which is astonishing, really.
Yes. You mentioned her the American editor, as it were, who was something of a managing editor, I think. Did she have some supervisory role over Audrey, or did that disappear in the wartime?
Well, it disappeared in the war. So what had happened was that American Vogue had been founded in the 1890s, and this young woman, Edna Woolman Chase, had been appointed in 1895, so pretty well from the word go. And she'd risen up through the ranks. And when Condé Nast bought the magazine in 1909, Edna was made managing editor, which was the role below editor. And then in 1911, she was appointed editor of American Vogue. And then Nast was persuaded to produce French Vogue and British Vogue, which are rather charmingly known as Brogue and Frogue. And so Brogue started in 1916 and Frogue in 1924. And Frogue's nickname was lost, but Brogue and Vogue were kept in order to differentiate the two. And over the 1920s and 30s, Edna Woolman Chase, as editor-in-chief, was a bit of an Anna Wintour figure. And she was incredibly dominant, and she had editorial control over content of Brogue. But of course, when the war broke out, that just simply fell by the wayside, because Audrey was dealing with the matters of the moment, and there was no way that Edna could influence. Although she did try, and she would occasionally, comment on something that Audrey had printed, something, maybe an article by Beaton that she either particularly liked or didn't like. And when Audrey employed new photographers, she was always very nervous, because Edna had strong views. And Edna was 30 years older than Audrey, so she was in her 60s during the war, and had been in charge for so long in America that she had sort of very little flexibility. So Audrey was fortunate that for the 5 years of the war, she really was autonomous. And that had a huge impact on the direction of travel of British Vogue in the post-war era as well.
What were Vogue's main competitors as periodicals, and did they manage to keep going in the war as well?
Yes, it was actually very interesting. The main competitor was Harper's Bazaar, run by a woman called Anne Scott James, whose son is the great historian Max Hastings. And Anne Scott James had started out life in the 1920s as Vogue's knitting editor, but it's not something she celebrated very much later on. So she was the editor of Harper's Bazaar. And then there was Life magazine, which was, of course, an American publication, but very much vying for the British market, particularly in terms of photography. So Harper's Bazaar and Vogue were the sort of the main competitors. And there was always a competition between Vogue and Harper's Bazaar as to how much how much advertising they'd managed to get. And Harry was always delighted that he used to get consistently 50 pages of advertising, and Harper's Bazaar only used to get about 13. So yeah, the rivalry was fierce. And when Audrey managed to get a photographer, who I'm sure we're going to talk about, into occupied France, she was very frustrated that these photographs went into a pool that could be used by any editor who hadn't got a photographer in Nazi-occupied Europe. And Harper's Bazaar were quick as a flash, were using these photographs, and it made Audrey's teeth grind in fury. And eventually she discovered that if they were fashion photographs, as opposed to war news, she could delay releasing them to the pool until Vogue had had their bite of the cherry.
That was rather handy.
Yes.
You mentioned the famous names that Audrey engaged as contributors and photographers. The photographers in particular come alive in your book as being particularly competitive and jealous of each other's work and their prominence. You write of Cecil Beaton and Norman Parkinson in particular. How did Audrey handle these temperamental creative souls?
Well, it's a really, really interesting question, that, John, because you would have thought in that era that a woman might have felt quite overwhelmed, especially by the presence of somebody like Cecil Beaton, whose fame with Vogue dated back to the 1920s. He'd started with them in 1925. But Audrey always said that the Oxford University tutorial system stood her in the best possible stead. And she described it as being like an athlete's training, where weekly she had to pit herself against some of the greatest intellectuals in the university. So if you think about that context, then dealing with Cecil Beaton having a tantrum, or Norman Parkinson ripping up a transparency in his teeth, she simply took the view that they were there to serve Vogue and their readership, which they duly did, and that although the photographer was king, Audrey, as the editor, always had the last word on what photograph would be used in the magazine, and she never, ever, ever let that go. And she even got into a terrible fight with the designer Edward Molyneux, verbal fight, when he accused her of, autocracy and other terrible things. He called her a dictator because he was livid that he couldn't choose the models that were going to go into a 1942 edition of Vogue. But she was having none of it. Vogue was independent. That was how she dealt with it. And she did say that Molyneux had tested her nerves more than any other of the creatives she worked with. But they had a huge amount of respect for her. And Cecil Beaton was very fond of Audrey. And when she retired in 1960, he wrote her a very personal, very affectionate letter. And Parkinson liked her. He trusted her because he knew that what she really wanted was the best photography for her magazine, and he wanted to give his best work. So it was a win-win situation.
So perhaps these stormy relationships were just part of the sort of creative tension of the world that they inhabited.
Oh, I think that's right. And she wasn't a combative and argumentative person. And I have various eyewitnesses to editorial meetings in the 1950s in particular, where she would sort of sit back at a meeting and she would watch the two fashion editors boxing and coxing with a junior features editor. And she would just quietly lean forward and say, "I think we'll do it like this." Very quietly, but everybody knew that she was right and she had the authority to do that. And she wasn't autocratic. She really believed in the democracy of a decision. And so when she invited comments on photographs to be selected for a fashion shoot, she'd send the photographs to the art director, to the fashion editor, to the photographer himself, and it usually was a him, and they'd all pool their ideas. And she would have her say on which photographs would be used. And she said very, very infrequently did she have to put her editorial foot down and say, "This is the image we will take." Mostly it was done by consensus, and she felt that was the very best way of getting the best out of people.
You wrote vividly about Cecil Beaton at one point getting the sack for putting an anti-Semitic reference in, was it in a photograph or in a cartoon?
Cecil Beaton was invited to illustrate a border around an article by Frank Crowninshield, who was a great friend of Condé Nast's, and it was to be reproduced in the January 1938 edition of Vogue. And he did this lovely elaborate border with bunches of flowers and fireplaces and sort of Christmassy things. And then he drew a tiny, tiny little newspaper cutting, and in it he inserted 3 anti-Semitic words, and you had to have a magnifying glass to see it, but somebody spotted it. And they'd already printed and distributed 40,000 copies of Vogue. So Condé Nast, stopped the printing, and Beaton was sacked because, as far as America was concerned, anti-Semitism was absolutely out. No two ways about it. Britain was a bit more, to be honest, anti-Semitic, but in America it was intolerable, and he was booted out of Vogue unceremoniously by Condé Nast, and he was out in the wilderness for pretty well 18 months. Until Edna Woolman Chase and Condé Nast realised how much they missed their star photographer, and they felt that he'd done his penance. And the war brought out something very impressive and patriotic in Beaton, and Nast had the grace to recognise that. And the war produced some of his very best photographic work. There's no two ways about it. And it was Audrey who reinstated him with Condé Nast's permission.
Was it he who was sent to the Middle East for the Ministry of Information?
Yes.
And produced some interesting work?
He did. So he was employed by the Ministry of Information in, I think, January 1940. So pretty early on in the war. He was desperate to do his stuff. He was appointed a colonel, given the rank of colonel, and he was sent all over the place, but the Middle East, where he sent some beautiful and moving images back of being embedded with the RAF. And then he was sent out to China and India. But in between times, he was sent by Audrey up to a Yorkshire airfield to photograph the RAF at work and to write about it. And there's this staggeringly moving and beautiful article in summer of 1940, written by Beaton, about what it was like to be involved at an RAF base and watching the young men go off and flying. And he said, a life can be measured in the time it takes to drink a pint of beer. He was deeply moved by that, and his war work is lovely. If you can describe war work as lovely, it's incredibly perceptive and sensitive and very photographically interesting. And he was a remarkable photographer, and as I say, he did some of his best work in the war.
One fascinating character who leaps out of your pages is Lee Miller, whom you hinted at a moment or so ago, the American woman photographer and war correspondent who contributed photographs and lively copy to Vogue over several wartime years. She comes across as an extraordinary, larger-than-life character. And her dispatches from the front in France and the Ardennes and Germany were obviously wonderfully appealing copy. I think it must be a mark of Audrey's genius that she managed to secure that copy for the pages of a fashion magazine. And I wonder quite how she did it.
Well, so Lee Miller, I had a real struggle with Lee Miller, because she could have occupied 4 chapters of the book, and I had to keep saying, no, Lee, back in your box, this is about Audrey, this is not about you. But what was really striking was the relationship and how it worked between Audrey and Lee Miller, because Lee Miller, here she was, one of the photographer Steichen's favourite models. Condé Nast had picked her up and put her on the front cover of Vogue, aged, I think, 17 in 1927. She was Man Ray's lover in the 1930s. She had become the surrealist painter Roland Penrose's lover in the late 1930s, and by the time the war broke out, she was in Antibes with Picasso and Dora Maar, as you are, and she fled with Roland Penrose before the fall of France to London and set up shop with him in Devonshire Hill, and wanted to work, and she wanted to work as a photographer. So she banged on the door of the Vogue photographic studio and secured some freelance work. And it was in the Blitz that Audrey recognized that she was a different kind of photographer from Beaton, who'd captured these, as I described earlier, these magical, artistic, very beautiful photographs. But what Lee Miller did was to capture the absurd and the juxtapositions. And so there's a very famous photograph of her with a pair of geese, and they're standing in front of a barrage balloon. And the caption is exceptional achievement. And she was witty, but she also had a great sense of humanity. And when Audrey was asked by Lee to help her get war accreditation, because as an American woman, she was entitled to, whereas no British women could, Audrey leapt at the opportunity because she could see that if they could get Lee into any war zone, it would give Vogue a worm's eye view of what was going on. And in fact, she was successful, and Lee was commissioned to photograph a Normandy field hospital in August 1944. And Audrey asked her to write the copy, and she produced 3,000 magnificent words, really beautiful description of landing in Free France, what was then Free France, or now Free France, of seeing these soldiers who were not knights in shining armor, but bedraggled, confused boys. And Audrey absolutely knew from that moment that she'd got a woman who could write and photograph in the same ilk as Beaton, but from a female perspective, emphasizing the humanity and the depravity of the war. And it was an incredible partnership. And she said later that the 18 months of Lee Miller's work with her at Vogue, or the 18 months of Lee's time from 1944 to 1946, were the greatest years of Lee Miller's creative life. And I think, honestly, they were the greatest creative years of Audrey Withers' editing. I think what they produced, the oeuvre they produced, was extraordinary. And to have a description of the liberation of Dachau concentration camp in the victory issue of a British fashion magazine is just, I would have said it wouldn't happen again until I saw Edward Enninful's magnificent summer editions of Vogue during the pandemic. And he's absolutely cut from the same cloth as Audrey. Just brilliant.
Which goes to show us that Vogue is a great deal more than just a fashion magazine.
Oh, it always is, and always has been. And I think that's one of the things that she was very keen to stress to Edna Woolman Chase after the war, was that Vogue was more than just about fashion. It was more than about selling clothes. It was a magazine about the whole woman, and it had wit and culture and beauty and humor and humanity and politics. And Edna couldn't swallow the politics, but she could swallow everything else. And so Audrey's Vogue was always full of features. She had a motoring editor, if you remember. Who knew? But cars were a fairly newfangled thing, and women had to learn how to drive them. So she had a motoring editor. She had Elizabeth David as her cookery editor or writer.
Her cookery editor.
Which is quite a coup. She wrote for Vogue.
Very impressive.
Yeah. So there we are. She just knew what that magazine needed, and all the time she knew that she was not bigger than Vogue. Vogue was always bigger as a personality than the individual editors, and that stands today.
I'm recalling that Lee Miller as a personality didn't thrive after the war. Her finest hour had been her years in France and Germany, and she had something of a tragic life after the war, the excitement of the war.
I think that's right. I mean, God, to have done what she'd done, seen what she'd seen, she'd been to Aldorf, not Belsen, Buchenwald, Aldorf Buchenwald, and was at Dachau in the day after it was liberated. She had PTSD. There's no two ways about it. And when she got back, there simply wasn't anything as exciting. And she said to Audrey, I have a taste for gunpowder. To which her psychiatrist replied, I'm afraid we can't create another war for you. And so she did slip very sadly into alcoholism. I think she painted as more of a tragic figure than she really was. I think in some ways she did find herself in the post-war era. She became an incredible cook, and she lived on a farm with her son. And so it's not entirely a disaster, but she didn't she didn't weather the post-war era well, as many didn't, and this is why I've been so fascinated by it.
You consulted her archive too, I think.
Yes, I went down to Farley's farm, which is where she and Roland Penrose lived with their son Anthony, who's still alive and is a remarkably charming man. And I looked at the archive there and read some of the correspondence between Audrey and Lee. And I interviewed Tony Penrose. And Tony Penrose said to me, I think that Audrey Withers was the only person on earth who could have handled my mother when she was going through her war years.
Audrey's, the peak of Audrey's career, as we've discussed and as your book focuses on, was World War II, although she had her successes post-war with the design and the Festival of Britain. And then she retired in 1960.
Yeah.
Do you think she recognized that her years were past? The swinging 60s were not for her. She was by then, I guess, what, 55?
Yes, I do. I think that's absolutely right, John. She recognized that she'd had 20 years at the helm and the magazine was in a very different place and fashion was becoming a very different kettle of fish. And she had the wit to know that she should step down before somebody gave her the unceremonial boot. And she did so very graciously and was much celebrated when she retired. What happened next was that rather than going and editing one of the Sunday magazines, which would have been the obvious thing for her to do, she went to live with her second husband on a farm in Essex, believe it or not, where they farmed cows and sheep and beetroot and all sorts of things. And which would have been okay, but she also had terrible back problems and was pretty well incapacitated for 5 years. And as a result, she sort of disappeared from the publishing scene, and she never really made a comeback. And it was mainly because Victor had felt that he wanted to spend the last years of his life with her, traveling and being with her on the farm, and then latterly in London. And I think he was quite possessive, to be honest, and she let him be. And it's something I've never really quite understood, except that she was so modest that she felt she'd done her bit and she didn't need to do any more. But I think had she retired from Vogue and not had that marriage, I suspect she would have gone on and would have been much better known now, because she would have probably gone to Sunday Times or possibly The Observer and edited the magazine there.
But she did go on to pursue political interests, social interests, and write a book or two.
Yes.
So,
well, she and Victor wrote a book on the palaces of Leningrad. He was a very good photographer, and so he did this magnificent, really handsome visual record of the palaces.
And he was Russian, I'm recalling.
He was Russian. Yeah, he was born in Russia in, I'm going to say 1890, something like that. But he fled to Europe, to Western Europe, to London eventually in 1917, and became a naturalized Englishman. But he always wanted to go back to Russia, and they went back for the first time in 1956. And they made 14 subsequent visits to Russia, and she loved it. She really loved Russia. She loved the Russians, but she was very sort of open-eyed about what was going on in Russia at the time. And one of the things she did was to bring with her when they went, and then subsequently send, huge numbers of books. Shakespeare, Agatha Christie was very popular, but other great British classics. And she would give these books and share them with the Russian friends that she and Victor met. And then Victor died in 1980, and Audrey immediately volunteered to work for the SDLP as the membership officer. And she worked for them for 10 years until she was 85. And then she retired and spent the rest of her long and very active life going to concerts, going to museums, corresponding with friends, traveling, and getting to know young people and really relishing in their love of life. And as she had done as a very young woman, talking to her father's older friends, there was a sort of wonderful cross-generational communication that she was just utterly gifted at. And so many people I've spoken to who knew her when they were in their 20s and 30s said, you know, she was such an energy. Her eyes sparkled. She was interested in everything, be it music or medical matters or literature or theatre. She just loved it, but she would never speak about herself. She was intensely private.
And that was reflected in her autobiography and, and all the things she kept quiet about.
And I think it was something to do with her mother. But anyway, there we go. That's another topic.
Well, there are lots of other topics we could cover, Julie, but the time allocated to us is ticking away. So I'm going to draw this part of the evening's Zoom meeting to a close. I'm going to put up on the screen your wonderful book, of which we've seen the cover on the video, and commend it to all who are listening. It's a great read. And I'm going to thank you warmly for answering the questions I've put so thoroughly and comprehensively and so interestingly. And I think the plan is now for me to hand back over to Elizabeth for time for audience questions. So with warm thanks, Julie, I'll hand back over to Elizabeth.
Well, thank you, John, very much indeed. That was hugely enjoyable.